From Austin Film Festival, this is On Story, a look inside the creative process from today's leading writers, creators, and filmmakers. This week's On Story, the co-writers behind A Quiet Place, Scott Beck and Bryan Woods.
It came to us because of the great Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Jacques Tati. We started thinking, like, why aren't there more silent films in that same regard these days? And we started thinking, like, what would a modern day silent film look like? And slowly but surely, like, that's how Quiet Place started coming together.
One of the greatest things I think about A Quiet Place is that it's based on a simple idea, but as far as I can tell, it seems no one seems to have thought about it before. So how did the idea first come to you?
When Bryan and I were in college, we were at the University of Iowa doing communication studies, and we did two classes. There was one, a nonverbal communication course, which was all about how we're communicating constantly when we're not saying a single word. And simultaneously, we were in a world cinema course where we were introduced to the films of Jacques Tati, this incredible French filmmaker who did films like Playtime and Mon Oncle, which were essentially silent films to a certain degree, but in the post-sound world, where all of the gags were communicated by physical movements through sound design. And we started thinking, like, why aren't there more silent films in that same regard these days? And we started thinking, like, what would a modern day silent film look like? And slowly but surely, like, that's how Quiet Place started coming together.
When we would pitch the idea to people, when we would pitch the idea of a family living on a farm that can't make any noise, and if they do, there's a monster outside that's gonna do bad things to them, nobody thought it was a cool idea.
How long was it from when you had the original idea and pitching it out to friends and colleagues and agents until you finally got to the point where you had a script that was ready to go out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in college we kind of came up with the germ of the idea. We called it our silent film, and we're like, someday we'll write our silent film. But it just felt like a gimmick. It felt like a cool idea, but it didn't have a story. And a few years ago is when we kind of like, okay, well, what if it's about this family that can't communicate and they've suffered a tragedy? Sort of like gelling together. And we wrote a proof of concept for ourselves, which was about, it was like a 15-page version of A Quiet Place, which is like all the major movements of the story. It's family living on a farm, they're playing Monopoly, scary monster, pregnancy, spoiler alert, I guess, leads up to a very important sacrifice by the father at the end, all in 15 pages to prove to ourselves that we could write something with no dialogue and communicate character and backstory and so forth. So we did that. And then from there, it took us a few months to actually write out the script.
When that spec script went out for sale, it's such a departure for what we think a script should look like. Not only was it only 67 pages, but you have a lot of visual elements in the script. You put the Monopoly board in the script. When you're coming up with this idea of creating this visual screenplay, you're throwing out all the so-called rules. My question is, what were you thinking?
Well, we were thinking the rules have been broken before in very effective ways when you have an intent. So we talk a lot about the script for 2001: A Space Odyssey, like for the incredible ship docking sequence, and it just says what, like the ship docks. Walter Hill and David Giler's draft of Alien like reads in a way that the words flow on the page vertically. Dan Gilroy's Nightcrawler's the same way, where there's no traditional slugs, and yet it creates such an incredible atmosphere and mood. So for us, it was very much about having conversations. How do we basically have the roadmap for essentially what is a dialogue-free movie that's still going to convey a very visual adventure, but also a sonic adventure, and figure out early in the process where the huge peaks and valleys are for the soundscape.
Can you tell us about how you discovered the rules for your world, and then how those rules helped you actually create the story?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it very much was thinking about, first and foremost, what are these sounds that attract these creatures? And I won't go into like every single rule, but very much it started as something that was generated by humans. So if you had like a giant wind turbine or a fan like in the distance that was creating loud noises, maybe the creatures would initially be attracted to that at first, but they would quickly realize like that's not something active. And so it'd be more about footsteps, for instance, or if somebody's, uttering a single word, that would start attracting them. So it very much was conversations that Bryan and I had behind the scenes in terms of what those rules were, what were the mythology of where did these creatures come from.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think we talked, just as much about, I suppose, talking about the rules of the monster and the world, we talked about how can the monster serve as a metaphor for what this family's dealing with. That in many ways, that was actually more important to us because we wanted to tell a story about characters and not necessarily about a monster. So we talked a lot about how if there were no aliens on Earth that react to sound, this family would still not be communicating with each other. They would still have communication problems because they suffered a loss of a family member. And ultimately, we wanted the monsters to kind of represent that, essentially. So a lot of the rules that conversations that we'd have was like, does it check that box? Does it meet that bar?
What was the rewrite process like once John Krasinski came on to direct and star with his wife Emily Blunt? And how did you work with John to take the spec script to the production draft?
What was incredible in terms of the timing of everything, the spec script, we were doing the rewrites and it fell into John and Emily's hands after it was like 3 or 4 weeks after they had their second child. And so if you've seen the movie, obviously there's a huge part of this film that's about family and about what you will do to protect your children and how do you have an open line of communication with them. And it struck them in such like an emotional chord.
Yeah, and I think he brought, his own personal experience as a father. Because at the time, I'm still not a father. Scott is a father now, but he was, at the time of writing, was a prospective father, somebody thinking about the idea of having kids. But John lived that, So what he brought as a writer, filmmaker, and performer is just making it personal and right in his sweet spot. And for us, we feel elevated the material.
And playing Monopoly, it feels like a throwback, but also feels like this quintessential American family activity. And everything we see up until them playing Monopoly here is just, it's what a family is, family life. It's just quiet. Can you talk about the importance of Monopoly in the original spec script? And then
it was an attempt to show the most normal family situation possible. And little by little, you start to realize something else is going on here. So we think we're watching just a normal family having a nice dinner and and playing Monopoly, but why aren't they saying anything? It's a little bizarre. And then, they hit the lantern, so to speak, and we realized, okay, there are monsters out here. And as it evolved, as the script evolved, it became, and the movie in many ways became more about a family who is living in this world with monsters and doing their very best to get back to a normal life.
One of the most important things to convey was that this family had the wherewithal and something instinctual to get them through the situation. Now, part of that is very important because they were living basically in a family that needed to know American Sign Language because of their daughter. But it also was this idea that they would take the time to make these home-cooked meals. They would take the time to play Monopoly, that there still was some sort of bond between them that would not break down in the face of everything that happened.
Come a little bit closer.
At first, when I first watched the film and saw this scene, it felt like, at first blush, it was like, it's a nice moment to show that the husband and wife are still emotionally connected. But then again, I realized this isn't so much that they're emotionally connected, but this feels like an essential survival tactic. If they can't stick together in the face of this apocalypse, without moments like this, they're gonna go crazy. And so I was just curious, what was your intention when you can first conceive this moment early in this story?
I think it was the idea that we knew we were telling essentially like a post-apocalyptic story, but we've all seen like the quintessential scenes of what that's like, and that was the attraction of doing the Monopoly scene, the dinner scene, but also this idea that this family has been through a lot. They've mourned a loss, but yet they're still able to come together in light of everything that's happened, and they're trying to forge ahead the best way they know how in terms of having this hopeful situation of possibly bringing a life into the world where you should not bring a world, or at least it's going to be very difficult when you try to give birth.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just the characters. It's trying to be thoughtful for the audience as well, right? Like, we don't, like, as audience members, we don't want to sit through like the dreariest post-apocalyptic story ever. It's nice to structurally kind of be able to ebb and flow and give some kind of nice, sweet moments.
When did you figure out, actually this story comes together emotionally around the breakdown of communication in a family?
That was like the second thought we had, because a movie itself cannot sustain itself with just set piece after set piece of just people making sounds and then getting killed by aliens. Like, that's going to be a very boring movie. So we needed that emotional through line to pull things through. So again, very early in the process, we kind of came up with that idea of where the story inevitably ends with the father and the sacrifice, and the idea that there was one thing he just had to say.
Were you ever worried, like, is this a little on the nose? It doesn't feel that way, but I could imagine as you're thinking of it, like, are we going a little far here, and how to find that balance? So when you finish, it's like, no, this makes absolute perfect sense for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of finding the balance, like, yes, it's a razor's edge, and you don't know if it's going to work until you just go do that. So we've fallen on our faces many times, and so we embrace failure, and we're like, okay, let's just try this and hope that you earn that final moment. And in terms of the evolution of her character and the story, it was just, it's script writing. So like an example of how all the conclusions come to what the final form is, the first incarnation of like the spec script, for instance, there was the tragedy focused in flashbacks. And that was very much an attraction we had, just in terms of, we like stories that have like this mystery that you get a piece here, but it's going to lead you somewhere else later, but you have to wait for that. And then the evolution of the script was very much, let's learn the rules from the get-go. So that first scene sets out all of those rules, and as soon as you figured that out, you realize we don't need the full backstory in terms of how Regan's character is deaf, and now it becomes, oh, she was born with this, and it wasn't necessarily like something that happened to her. So, and what it did is it creates this very narrow focused movie, and hopefully the best way possible, where you're just living in this little circle and there's not these ancillary things that are kind of poking out throughout the process. So.
Let's talk about the nail and how sadistic you were to put it in the script in the first place. More to the point, did the nail come out of the process of figuring out the rules of the world and how this family has to be as quiet as possible, and what would be, a great way to put the ability to stay silent to the test? Because it's not just that the nail, it's not just the nail, it's stepping on the nail when the character is in their most extreme duress.
When we were writing the script, early on, we put a nail on the staircase. And we had no idea when that was going to pay off. But we're just like, at some point, somebody's going to step on this nail and it's going to hurt. And then we just wrote ourselves into, the scariest, darkest corner we possibly could. And then we're like, now she steps on the nail. It's just like, it's fun for us to be able to find those things and not necessarily know exactly how they're going to come out.
But that pregnancy thing came, again, that was very early in the process, where what's the worst thing you could have happen where you can't make a sound, but like you have to make a sound. And that started building this whole sequence that then became about the family already have enacted this contingency plan where it's about lighting the fireworks, so that becomes a distraction momentarily. But of course, like, we wanted to put the creature there right at the worst case scenario when she's having the birth in the bathtub. So,
did you guys create a map for you to map out where your characters were as you're writing? Okay, this is the scene where we are right now. Where is everybody geographically?
Yeah, I mean, it's the closest thing there is in the original spec script, the Monopoly board also stood in for a map of the farm, but it very much was having, a giant, eraser board and figuring out, okay, if John's character is over here, that means that Emily's character has to be here. So when she gives birth, he's here, the son's here. They have to come together, and then they have to go apart, and the fireworks are based here. So it very much was this very bizarre way of breaking story by way of geography.
Well, and it helps that so Scott and I have known each other since we were 11 years old, and we grew up in Iowa together. So it's easy for us to be like, all right, you remember Ian Klink's farm had this like silo off in the distance, and then over there's the farm. We have a shared life experience that we can kind of always tap into when we're working.
What I love about here is with the changes, you give the daughter more agency. You get to see her make a decision. She jumps in to protect a sibling, something that is a callback to earlier in the film, that she feels that she failed the family, perhaps. So it adds real emotional stakes to the scene as opposed to just it's a set piece. Sure. And I just really would love to hear, you guys talk about what it means to create a set piece like this and to build into it those emotional stakes, and then also think about things like, setting up other beats, such as the hearing aid that's going to come back.
Yeah, well, this was a fun scene to work on. It was, again, talking about our chess pieces. We knew we wanted the characters to kind of go up to the top of the silo so that they could see the father could find them, they could connect. And we were sitting in Scott's computer room, and we do this on all of our projects. It's just like, this is the fun of writing for us, is we sit around and we go, what's the scariest thing that could happen? Like, what's a terrifying thing? We just kind of start making lists. And Scott, being from Iowa and having heard weird stories about corn silos, said, well, corn silos are really dangerous. And I'm like, in what way? And he's like, you can drown in them. And I'm like, that sounds weird. So we left that brainstorm session, and I started Googling it, and sure enough, people do fall in corn silos and grain silos occasionally, farmers, when they're working, and you drown so fast. It's very, very, very deadly. So we're like, that has to go in the movie. But initially, as you pointed out, it was just the daughter. It was just Reagan. And that was one of the ideas that John brought to the table. And I love that you're highlighting the kind of dynamic that she has agency and she has to save the brother, because I think that's one of the things that John could see from the kind of 30,000-foot view of fresh eyes is that actually kind of starts to connect an arc for her. And then as far as the monster hitting the silo and them spilling out, that was actually a production limitation. So that was something that we had every intention of shooting and filming, but it was just, it was too expensive and I think logistically too difficult. Originally the scene ends with the monster kind of getting inside the corn silo with them as they're drowning, and then ruptures a hole in the silo, and they were supposed to spill out.
And since you said it was a production issue that you couldn't have the corn spilling out, you have to find another way out. And so again, was that the hearing aid, I imagine at that point in time, had already been something that you had determined was going to, and it happens earlier, obviously, and she has no idea the monster's there. This time, the monster's there, but she doesn't understand what's happening. Was there some push and pull dynamic there to figure out how to fix it if it didn't work in production?
Sometimes there is. In this instance, there always were those fence posts of when you needed to introduce like the situation with the hearing aid and the feedback frequency so that you could earn the ending. So this was one of those cases where it's like, oh, let's just rip a giant hole in the silo and that'll be, end scenes. It's just one of those things where you have a finite amount of days that you have to shoot, and the whole process of being on a film set is just problem solving and figuring out situations like this where you're running out of time or running out of resources. So.
I think it's really important when we're writing stories to think about what is an audience going to want to see. And I know from a pure plot perspective, this is what had me sold on wanting to see this movie. You're going to give me a pregnant woman giving birth in a bathtub, monsters on the stairs, hunts by sound, sold. And I'm curious though, because in the script that went out for sale, this moment happens much earlier in the story. And so talk to us about the process of shifting that moment later in the script and what that shift had as an impact on the overall story.
Totally, yeah. It was something that ebbed and flowed throughout our entire writing process, all the way from the initial outlines and proof of concept. We were always like we were always asking ourselves, how long can you sustain a story without dialogue? Like, how invested will people be? And can you hook them long enough to push the pregnancy later? Is the pregnancy the inciting incident, or is that the kind of fulcrum of the story, and is that what happened? And so, again, in our insecurity, I think we front loaded it in the spec, and we wanted it to be this like big kind of explosive hook of sorts. And I think when John came on, he had that confidence to kind of marinate in the characters, live in this world, and really just, it's interesting. The final film, for me, like the first act really plays as kind of a tone poem of sorts. We're just very quietly following these characters around, and I think what we didn't expect, or maybe we hoped in our wildest dreams, is that even in a world where the first half of the film is very low-key and we're just following these characters, it's latently suspenseful because you know any noise whatsoever it could bring the monsters.
So putting a baby in this story is genius, because obviously childbirth's going to be loud, but good luck telling a baby to be quiet. And what I like about this scene too is earlier you give us this false sense of security that everything they've been working on to create this quiet room, it actually worked. And there's this moment where we feel a sense of security, and okay, I'm gonna rip that security blanket right away from you.
So it became about having that creature in the same space as the baby, and there was that whole suspense of what's going to occur here. In the spec script versus how the final shape of it evolved, there was another moment in the spec script where they had this huge collection of water, and the creature had gotten in, punctured that, and started creating this leak. And what happened throughout the process of getting the movie made, those two ideas came together in a really fascinating way, which resulted in this scene where all of a sudden that water is creating this flooded basement. And one of the moments that I absolutely love that ILM was such an instrumentational part about was the creature going underneath the water and not knowing where that was. And again, that all came from that mantra that collectively the production team, we were like, you cannot see the monster. What's scariest is when you don't see it, and it's only about the suggestion of it or what you hear. So for me, that's one of the more suspenseful parts that kind of evolved throughout that collaboration process.
You've been watching a conversation with Scott Beck and Bryan Woods on Story. On Story is part of a growing number of programs in Austin Film Festival's On Story project, including the On Story PBS series, now streaming online, the On Story radio program, the On Story podcast, and the On Story book series, available where books are sold. To find out more about On Story and Austin Film Festival, visit onstory.tv or austinfilmfestival.com.